Among the many crimes that have been publicized over the decades, those rare few investigations that are only able to uncover more questions than answers have had a tendency to take the media by storm. When the perpetrators of these acts remain at large despite the best efforts of police forces, innocent families are often left with little choice but to fear for the safety of their loved ones. The Tylenol murders, the subject of today's video, raised an alarming question. How can a person prepare for an attack that nobody expects? On the morning of September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Schaumburg, a suburb of Chicago, Illinois, woke up feeling sick around 6:30 in the morning. She told her parents, who agreed to let her stay home from school that day. She took some Tylenol to alleviate her symptoms before heading into the bathroom. Just minutes later, however, her parents heard a thud. They went to investigate the noise, opening the door to find their daughter collapsed on the floor, completely unresponsive. They called the paramedics, who soon arrived and transported the young girl to the hospital. Despite their best efforts, the medical staff was unable to resuscitate Mary. She was pronounced dead at 9:56 a.m. at Alexian Brothers Medical Center in Elk Grove Village. An autopsy was conducted due to her age and the sudden circumstances of her death. However, nothing about the incident was unusual enough to warrant suspicion. In Arlington Heights, another Chicago suburb, on that same day, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janus had taken the day off due to feeling that he was getting a cold. He picked up his children from preschool around noon, stopping at the drugstore afterwards to buy some painkillers. He and his children had lunch once at home, and Janus stated that he was going to take 2 Tylenol and lie down. Minutes later, however, he stumbled back into the kitchen before collapsing. Janus was rushed to Northwest Community Hospital's ICU and later pronounced dead at 3:15 by medical director Thomas Kim, who stated that they were completely unable to resuscitate Janus and that his death was signed off as likely cardiac. Around 5 p.m., Janus's family went back to his house to come together and mourn. Janus's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, as well as Stanley's wife, 19-year-old Teresa, were among them. Stanley, who suffered from chronic back pain, asked Teresa to get him some Tylenol. Both Stanley and Teresa took 2 Tylenol each, and within minutes, both had also collapsed. With the hospitalization of 2 more members of the Janus family just hours after Adam's death, hospital staff began to grow increasingly concerned. Efforts were made to resuscitate the 2, but by 8:15 p.m., Stanley Janus was pronounced dead and his wife Teresa was in critical condition and not expected to pull through. An investigation into the case was led by Nick Pichos, who visited the household around 8 o'clock that night to search for any possible contaminants that may have inadvertently led to the hospitalizations of the 3 family members. Nurse Helen Jensen, who had spoken to the Janus family directly and accompanied the investigative team, came across a bottle of Tylenol, taking notice that 6 capsules were missing. Knowing that 3 people had been hospitalized, she had a hunch that the Tylenol was somehow involved and decided to take the bottle along with her when the team returned to the hospital. With no immediately apparent chain of evidence, the hospital staff was perplexed. Soon after Nurse Jensen's insistence that the incidents had been related to the bottle of Tylenol that she had found, however, investigator Pichos contacted the Elk Grove Village paramedics that had attended to 12-year-old Mary Kellerman just earlier that day. He discovered that the paramedics had decided to inventory the bottle of Tylenol that had been discovered in Mary's house, so Pichos asked that it be brought to him for examination. Upon receiving the bottles from each house, investigator Pichos found that the control numbers on each were the same, MC 2880. He contacted Edmund Donahue of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, who asked him to open the bottles and smell them. Pichos noted that upon pouring the contents out, there was a very strong scent of almonds, finding this to be true with the second bottle as well. Both Pichos and Donahue immediately came to the same conclusion. The scent that Pichos had noticed was a telltale indicator of the presence of cyanide. Potassium cyanide, a well-known compound extremely toxic to humans, can be indicated by the distinct smell of bitter almonds. However, it's said that only about half the population is able to detect this. Cyanide is deadly because it's a chemical asphyxiant, which blocks the use of oxygen by red blood cells. When a person ingests a lethal dose of cyanide, they're unable to take in oxygen and end up asphyxiating, leading to brain damage and cardiac arrest. The amount of cyanide found in the Tylenol bottles belonging to Mary Kellerman and the Janus family was over 1,000 times more than that of a lethal dose. That same day, September 29th, also saw the hospitalizations of 27-year-old Mary Lynn Reiner of Winfield, Illinois, and 31-year-old Mary McFarland of Elmhurst. Reiner, who had given birth to her 4th child just a week prior, was not feeling well and took some Tylenol around 3:45 p.m. before collapsing shortly after. McFarland was at work around 6:30 p.m. when she told some of her coworkers that she didn't feel well. She went into the back room, took some Tylenol, and, like the other victims before her, fell unconscious. On the morning of September 30th, both Mary Lynn Reiner and Mary McFarland were pronounced dead. When the investigations into the hospitalizations of the now 6 affected individuals came to light, police officials began to realize the connections between what they initially believed to be isolated incidents. At around 10 a.m., an attorney from Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol's manufacturer, met with a toxicologist from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, who explained their findings thus far. Johnson & Johnson's attorney was cooperative, staying for only around half an hour before agreeing that the information would have to be released. A press conference was very quickly organized, where Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue warned those in the area of the situation and advised them against taking any Tylenol for the time being. Nurse Helen Jensen, however, took this a step further and urged the local police department to get the product off of the shelves immediately. With some effort on Jensen's part, they conceded, and at 3 p.m., just hours later, Johnson & Johnson issued an official recall of all Tylenol from lot MC 2880. By the time the medical examiner's office held their press conference, however, another life had already been claimed. 35-year-old Paula Prince was found dead in her Old Town apartment on October 1st, though an autopsy and security footage from a local Walgreens taken of Prince purchasing a bottle of Tylenol proved that she had died on September 29th, the first day of the string of poisonings. Paula Prince's death in particular struck fear into local officials. She lived in the heart of Chicago, a city housing millions of people, and several feared how many more could die if immediate action was not taken. Massive efforts were made to spread awareness to the public about the poisonings. Following Paula Prince's death, all of the Tylenol in the entire city was pulled off of store shelves, and on October 5th, Johnson & Johnson recalled all Tylenol products nationwide, a move that cost them more than $100 million. With Teresa Janus being taken off of life support on October 1st, the string of poisonings later attributed to the individual whom the public had dubbed the Tylenol Killer had taken the lives of 7 people. Nationwide, media outlets, as well as the general public, were in a complete frenzy. As the investigation carried on over the course of several days, thousands of tips were called into local police departments. However, ultimately, none seemed to lead anywhere. In the chaos of the investigation, many theories surfaced. Some wondered if the Tylenol Killer was an ex-employee of Johnson & Johnson, someone who wanted to enact revenge on the company directly. Others were convinced that the murders were based on indiscriminate violence, or even a terrorist attack meant to be a power play against the general public. On October 6th, just a week after the first of the incidents, a handwritten letter arrived at Johnson & Johnson's headquarters, one that finally gave authorities what seemed like a promising lead. An extortion letter from an unknown sender, one that claimed to have been the Tylenol Killer. In the letter, the sender speaks remorselessly, describing what little effort went into contaminating the medicine on store shelves. Threatening to repeat these acts, the sender writes, "If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account number 844-9597 at Continental Illinois Bank, Chicago, Illinois. Don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this letter. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do." Johnson & Johnson, deeply disturbed by the content of the message and concerned that the letter's claims were valid, prepared to send the ransom. However, the FBI quickly interfered and advised against this. For the next several weeks, the investigation turned to the sender of this letter, a man that police were later able to identify as James W. Lewis of New York City. Following a large-scale manhunt, Lewis, who had been living along with his wife under a number of different pseudonyms at the time, was apprehended on December 13, 1982 at a public library in New York City. Other than his letter, which he did not deny writing, no evidence could be tied to Lewis to suggest that he had anything to do with the killings. For all intents and purposes, Lewis was, to the majority of police officials, nothing more than a con artist who intended to profit off of the recent tragedies. Despite being the one and only suspect to date, Lewis was not charged in connection with the Tylenol murders. He was, however, charged with attempted extortion and went on to serve 13 years in prison. For all the tragedy that the incident had incurred, the widespread attention that the case had spawned did manage to create a number of changes in an attempt to prevent such occurrences from ever happening again. On account of the Tylenol murders, the FDA now requires over-the-counter drugs to be sold in tamper-evident packaging. And on May 9, 1983, the United States Congress unanimously passed the Tylenol Bill, which acts as an allowance for immediate federal intervention in future tampering cases and provides penalties up to life in prison for those found guilty of such crimes. Despite these assurances, the Tylenol murders did go on to inspire a number of copycat crimes over the years, perhaps most famously the 1986 case of Stella Nichol, a resident of Seattle. Nichol poisoned her husband Bruce's Excedrin with cyanide before going on to tamper with the Excedrin at her local pharmacy in an attempt to avoid suspicion in her husband's death. This would lead to the death of 40-year-old Susan Snow, who was a complete stranger to the Nichol family. Stella Nichol was found guilty of double homicide and sentenced to 2 terms of 90 years in prison for the murders. To this day, it's unknown who committed the Tylenol murders 38 years ago or what their motive was. As with many similar cold cases, the prospect of identifying the Tylenol killer after so many years may seem like nothing more than a pipe dream. But to many, like the surviving families of the victims and the members of the police force, there exists a deep-seated sense of hope that someday the Tylenol killer will be brought to justice. If you have any information regarding the 1982 Tylenol murders, please call the Chicago Police Department at 312-746-6000. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.